Somewhere on a rainy back road in 1963, a man named Robert Kearns is driving home from church, and his windshield wiper is doing something that annoys him more than it should. In a light drizzle, the wiper sweeps back and forth at exactly the same constant speed it would use in a heavy downpour, smearing the glass, wasting motion, wearing down the rubber blade for no good reason at all. Most drivers would simply shrug and turn the knob to a lower setting, resigned to the inconvenience as just another unavoidable quirk of driving in the rain. Kearns, an engineering professor at Wayne State University with a curious, restless mind and a damaged left eye from a freak accident on his own wedding night, saw something else entirely. He saw a genuine problem worth solving properly. What he built in his basement over the following months would eventually reach almost every car on Earth, and the way Japanese manufacturers responded to it would quietly reshape the entire philosophy of how they engineered their vehicles for decades to come. This is that story, and today it goes back to the root of a single frustrating windshield to understand exactly why. To understand why this problem mattered so much, one has to understand how primitive windshield wipers actually were in the middle of the 20th century. Every wiper motor on every car built through the 1950s and well into the 60s operated on a single fixed principle: constant speed, constant motion, with no pause between sweeps whatsoever. A driver caught in a light mist had exactly two choices: leave the wipers off entirely and squint through a smeared, gradually fogging windshield, or turn them on and endure a constant scraping, streaking motion across dry or nearly dry glass, which wore down the rubber blades far faster than necessary and created its own visual distraction. This wasn't a minor inconvenience buried in an owner's manual footnote. It was a genuine safety hazard that every single driver on Earth experienced at some point, in every country, on every continent, from a farmer navigating a muddy Tokyo suburb to a commuter crawling through a foggy Los Angeles freeway, and yet for more than half a century of automotive engineering, nobody had solved it. The technology to fix it, adding a simple pause between wiper sweeps using an electronic timing circuit, was not particularly exotic by the standards of 1963 electronics. It simply required someone to actually sit down and build it, and that someone turned out to be a professor working alone in his house in Detroit, the very city where the American automotive industry had built its empire. Kearns built his intermittent wiper mechanism using a transistorized circuit that could pause the wiper blade for a controllable, adjustable interval between each sweep, letting a driver dial in exactly the right rhythm for a light drizzle instead of being trapped between fully off and fully on. He patented the design and, believing he had built something genuinely valuable, brought it directly to the Ford Motor Company, demonstrating it personally to their engineers in 1963. Ford was reportedly impressed. And then, according to Kearns and the lengthy legal battle that followed for the rest of his life, Ford quietly incorporated a nearly identical intermittent wiper system into its own vehicles without ever paying him a cent, without ever crediting the invention, treating the small inventor's breakthrough as simply another piece of engineering the company's own team had apparently developed independently. Kearns spent the following decades of his life, well into the 1990s, fighting an exhausting legal war against Ford and later Chrysler, eventually winning tens of millions of dollars in damages, but losing years of his career, his first marriage, and much of his personal stability along the way. It was, by nearly every account, one of the most bitter and drawn-out patent disputes in American industrial history, later dramatized in a Hollywood film starring Greg Kinnear that only scratched the surface of how deeply this simple pause between wiper sweeps had upended one man's entire life, his finances, and his family. The human cost of this dispute deserves its own moment of reflection, because it explains why this particular story carried so much weight across the industry for decades afterward. Robert Kearns was not a wealthy corporate engineer with a legal department behind him. He was a solitary inventor who genuinely believed that bringing his idea directly to Ford in good faith would lead to a fair licensing arrangement and perhaps a modest but respectable income for his family. Instead, he spent the better part of 30 years of his life consumed by litigation, representing himself in court for long stretches because he could no longer afford or trust outside attorneys, missing his children growing up, and by his own later admission, sacrificing his marriage and his peace of mind chasing acknowledgement for a single transistorized pause circuit. When he finally won his case against Ford in 1990, and later against Chrysler in 1992, the settlements totaled well over $30 million combined, a genuine vindication on paper. But those close to him often said the money never truly compensated for what the fight itself had taken from him personally. While American manufacturers were tangled in courtrooms and depositions over who actually owned the idea, something quieter and more consequential was happening on the other side of the Pacific. Japanese automakers, still building their export reputation through the 1960s and 70s on the back of reliability rather than raw innovation, watched this entire saga unfold from a distance, and they drew a very different lesson from it than their American counterparts did. Rather than treating the intermittent wiper as a courtroom battleground to be won or a feature to quietly copy and bury in legal ambiguity, companies like Toyota, Nissan, and later Honda approached it the way they approached almost every incremental improvement during this era of their development, as a small, unglamorous detail that mattered enormously to the ordinary driver's daily experience, even if it never appeared on a single glossy advertisement or brochure headline. Japanese engineers of this generation had been raised on a design culture rooted in the post-war principle of constant, humble refinement, a philosophy the Japanese themselves would later formalize under names like Kaizen, meaning continuous improvement, applied not just to factory efficiency but to every small mechanical detail a driver might interact with thousands of times over the life of a vehicle. By the mid-1970s, intermittent wipers began appearing as a genuine, well-executed feature across Japanese vehicles being exported to American and European markets, often as a simple, elegant rotary switch on the turn signal stalk that let a driver dial in exactly the pause interval a specific rain condition demanded. What made the Japanese implementation notable wasn't that they invented the underlying concept. It was the quiet, obsessive refinement Japanese engineers applied to the execution itself, studying real driver behavior to match the available pause intervals to genuine rainfall patterns rather than offering a token version of the feature just to check a marketing box. The refinement didn't stop with a simple rotary pause switch either. That was only the beginning of a much larger philosophy that continued to evolve over the decades. As technology advanced and electronics became increasingly sophisticated, Japanese manufacturers didn't abandon the principles that had guided those early improvements. Instead, they built upon them, treating every new innovation as another opportunity to make the driving experience feel just a little more natural, a little more intuitive, and a little more effortless for the person behind the wheel. Eventually, that same philosophy found its way into an entirely new generation of windshield wiper technology. Automatic rain sensing systems began appearing in Japanese vehicles, using compact optical sensors mounted discreetly near the rearview mirror. These sensors constantly monitored the amount of moisture collecting on the windshield, adjusting the speed and timing of the wipers without the driver needing to touch a single control. It was a sophisticated solution, yet its purpose remained remarkably simple: remove one more small distraction from everyday driving. What makes this evolution so fascinating is that the underlying mindset never really changed. The technology became far more advanced, but the engineering philosophy remained almost identical to the one that inspired those first intermittent systems decades earlier. Every sensor, every calibration, and every carefully programmed delay reflected the same patient attention to detail that engineers had once devoted to a relatively simple mechanical timing mechanism. Looking back, it's easy to trace one continuous, unbroken thread running through all of these developments. From a modest pause switch to intelligent rain-sensing electronics, the guiding principle stayed remarkably consistent. No detail is ever too small to deserve serious engineering effort if it affects the driver's experience, even for just a few seconds during an ordinary journey. In the world of Japanese automotive design, those seemingly insignificant moments were never considered too minor to improve, and over time, that relentless pursuit of refinement became one of the defining characteristics of their cars. So the real story behind how a simple windshield wiper problem ended up changing virtually every Japanese car was never really about the windshield wiper itself. On the surface, it seems like a story about a tiny automotive feature that most drivers barely notice. But beneath that simple invention lies a much bigger story about persistence, engineering, and the unexpected ways one person's frustration can influence an entire industry halfway around the world. Robert Kearns never set out to transform Japanese automotive engineering when he assembled that small transistorized circuit in the basement of his home back in 1963. He wasn't trying to build a revolutionary product, change manufacturing philosophy, or leave his mark on automotive history. His goal was surprisingly ordinary. He simply wanted his own windshield wipers to stop dragging water across the glass during a light drizzle, allowing him to drive safely without the constant distraction of smeared streaks every few seconds on what should have been a completely normal drive home from church. Yet history has a funny way of turning small inconveniences into major turning points. The ripple effects of that single frustrating afternoon spread much farther than Kearns could ever have imagined. His invention, and the legal battle that followed, eventually reached manufacturers across the globe, influencing not only the way windshield wipers operated but also encouraging a broader philosophy of refining the countless small details that drivers experience every single day. Japanese automakers became especially known for embracing this mindset. Rather than focusing only on horsepower or flashy styling, They built their reputation by improving hundreds of tiny features that most customers would never consciously notice but would appreciate every time they drove. Those invisible refinements, small controls that felt smoother, systems that worked more naturally, and features that quietly made everyday driving easier, became part of what made Japanese cars feel so dependable and thoughtfully engineered. If you've ever adjusted your intermittent wipers during a rainy commute without giving the mechanism a second thought, you've experienced the lasting impact of that simple idea. It's one of those everyday conveniences that feels completely ordinary today, yet it exists because one determined inventor refused to believe that a streaked windshield was simply something every driver had to accept. So the next time you're driving through a light rainstorm and your wipers move with that familiar, perfectly timed rhythm, remember that behind such an ordinary feature is an extraordinary story of determination, innovation, and a single engineer whose refusal to settle ultimately helped shape the character of modern Japanese automobiles. And if this story surprised you, let us know in the comments. We'd love to hear whether you'll ever look at your windshield wipers the same way again.